patiently for the Lord. He turned and heard my cry. He lifted me up from the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock. He put a new song within my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and they will fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who trusts only in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, those who turn to their idols.
Hi everyone, Phil, you're just on mute.
Hello, Jord. Hello, Sam.
Hiya.
Great to have everyone on tonight as we got another psalm for us. We're looking at Psalm 40. Where does that fit, Jord, in the overall big picture of the book of Psalms?
Well, as you can imagine, Phil, I'm getting quite excited because we are coming now towards the end of book 1 in the Psalter, and this is the last but one psalm of book 1. And what's lovely about this psalm is we're going to see, I think, as Sam's going to sort of lead us tonight in some thoughts, we're going to see lots of these big themes that we've come across. We've seen. We're going to see a title. We're going to see Christ perhaps in this psalm. Steadfast love appears, and I think we're going to see a little bit of CPT, but perhaps in a bit of a different order than we're perhaps used to it in the other psalms that we've come across. So before we hand over to Sam to lead us in some thoughts around Psalm 40, I'm just going to read Psalm 40 for us. So I just have to stop sharing a second and share again. Okay, so let's read Psalm 40 together. Psalm 40, to the choir master, a psalm of David. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts toward us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than can be told. In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book, it is written of me. I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. As for you, O Lord, you will not restrain your mercy from me. Your steadfast love and your faithfulness will ever preserve me. For evils have compassed me beyond number. My iniquities have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head. My heart fails me. Be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me. O Lord, make haste to help me. Let those be put to shame and disappointed altogether who seek to snatch away my life. Let those be turned back and brought to dishonor who delight in my hurt. Let those be appalled because of their shame who say to me, aha, aha. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who love your salvation say continually, great is the Lord. As for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, O my God. So quite started off quite positive, but perhaps quite a dramatic end to that psalm. So Sam, look to you now to share some thoughts with us and lead us in some discussions about Psalm 40.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, first of all, I suppose.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
So I thought we could start by just looking back a bit at some of the Psalms that come previously to that, just to give a little bit of a kind of a broader context to this Psalm. So if we just go back to Psalm 37, it's quite a long Psalm. We're just going to go through these 37, 38, and 39. We're going to go through quite quickly. But Psalm 37, we read an idea that we get about waiting on the Lord that we're going to see is kind of developed, and it's going to be how Psalm 40 begins. So if we look at verse 9, it says, for the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. And then again in verse 34, wait for the Lord and keep his way. And this psalm is very confident. It's like the psalmist instructing, or David instructing people, saying, this is what you should do, and you should wait on the Lord, and you'll get these blessings, and this is what will happen to people that don't. It kind of very reminds me a bit like of the Proverbs. So you have the very confident, sure kind of idea of waiting on the Lord, and good comes of that. And then when we move on to Psalm 38, it like instantly becomes much more negative. So we have like this lament in Psalm 38. It says, verse 2, your arrows have sunk into me. But the idea of waiting, you don't get the same word, but you can read verse 22. So right at the end, it ends with make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. So you get that same idea of someone saying, who's waiting for God, but now who really desperately wants God to come. And so it's become much more negative. That very stable, sure statement of, those who wait on the Lord, they will be blessed and they'll inherit the land, has changed. And this person now is in a really difficult situation, and they're saying, come quickly, God. And then when we move into Psalm 39, it continues, and it's maybe even more kind of desperate. So we can read in Psalm 39, verse 12. Here I'm not sure that's the right one. Sorry, I've lost my verse. Oh, sorry, verse 7. So Psalm 39, verse 7, it says, and now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. So again, it's a lament, and this person's kind of saying, all I can do is wait and hope for God. That's all. I'm in such a difficult position that my only hope is God. And then when we start Psalm 40, it starts with this word wait again. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he did hear my cry. So from Psalm 37, that very sure kind of idea of, this is what you should do, you should wait. And then we have these two Psalms that show someone who's really struggling to wait and really wants God to come quickly. And then we start Psalm 40, and it's kind of come round, it's very positive again. And actually in the Hebrew, I think those two words at the beginning, the ESV says waited patiently, but it's actually it's the same word twice. It's like, I waited on the Lord. So it's a real emphasis of this idea of waiting. And they're they're rejoicing in that God has come and he's heard them, and he says lifted them out of the pit. So that's kind of how we start it, thinking about what's kind of happened, and then we come to a positive kind of beginning.
It's fascinating. Sorry, Sam.
Sorry.
It's fascinating to see that progression of waiting. We have seen some of those progression in other psalms and the way they're structured, haven't we, Jord? So I remember John White taking us through about the trust of God. By the time he got to Psalm 20, he sort of painted it for us about how the way that God would be there for the king, and it seems now that there's almost a smaller structure within the big, even within the books of the Psalm, Jord, that we've been talking about, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Almost structures within structures. And but I think what's helpful is it's almost like a preempt, isn't it, to what we're about to experience in Psalm 40, like the climax of what he's been leading up to. And I think in a future session we'll have perhaps a little bit of help from somebody on looking at how God sort of placed the Psalms in this particular order in the Psalter, and why we find the Psalms in this order, because chronologically at times we're not sure why they're placed in this order, but we can see patterns like this that you brought out, Sam, which I think are really helpful to bring us into different Psalms.
Yeah, it is. It's almost like it's not a story, but there's a kind of narrative of like a thematic narrative, isn't there, that's kind of getting you to see how things change and develop, like when we just take that idea waiting. But I think it's like what you said about we're coming to the end of book 1, and it's kind of almost preparing us for what we're going to move on to. It actually, even though I've just said it's a very positive beginning, the Psalm seems to be in like 2 parts, and the second part is not positive. It's actually you find out that David is in a really difficult place, and what he starts doing is actually talking about the past. So when you read that first bit about him waiting, he's actually talking about a past time when he was in the pit, and he's reflecting on how God did save him. So he says, I waited patiently for the Lord, it's past tense, and he inclined to me and heard my cry, and he drew me up out of the pit of destruction. And verse 3, put a new song in my mouth. And then he goes on to say, like in verse 4, blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust. And it kind of goes on to talk about how God has done wondrous deeds. And no one can compare with you. That's in verse 5. So you start off with David kind of talking about this past situation where he was waiting. He was in the pit, and it was this real trial in his life. And now he's saying, and God rescued me out of that. And he's thanking God for it, and kind of recognizing how wonderful and wondrous God is.
It's interesting. It reminded me just how you described in that psalm of what we looked at a few weeks ago in Psalm 32, in that psalm where David sort of saying, blessed is the one whose transgression and sin is forgiven. And he sort of goes through that process of what he went through in possibly his sin with Bathsheba. And just like here, you talked about a song being put in his mouth. In verse 7, it's slightly different in the ESV, but in other versions, it talks about God surrounding him with songs of deliverance. And we spoke a little bit about that, didn't we, last time, Phil, which again is one of these patterns or themes that seems to come up. And obviously we're surrounded with this psalter that's full of songs of deliverance to encourage us, just like they did for David when he composed and sang them as well.
Yeah.
So it's reflecting on the past then at the start, and then where does it make that switch?
Yeah. So the 2 parts, it's kind of like different people disagree with exactly where it kind of there's one half and the second half, but the first, like, say 10 verses is this reflecting on the past and this situation that he's been delivered from. And then when you kind of come to verse 11 onwards, it kind of has this change where, verse 11 connects with what's just been said. So he says in verse 11, as for you, O Lord, you will not restrain your mercy. So that sounds very positive. But then he goes on to say, for evils have encompassed me beyond number. My iniquities have overtaken me. And you carry on reading. He talks in verse 14 about those that seek to snatch away his life, who delight in his hurt, who say in verse 15, aha, aha. And these are kind of his enemies have come, and also his iniquities that he's mentioned. And you get to verse 17, he says, I'm poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, oh my God. So it actually finishes with kind of David saying, please hurry up and come. And it's more like Psalms 38 and 39 again. So where it started with David reflecting on, in the past, you saved me. And it leads into this kind of being so thankful. You then have this last little section, which is much more like a lament of him saying, I'm in one of those situations again. But this time it ends with that, and it ends negative. So that's interesting, because I suppose normally, or maybe more typically, we're used to it the other way around. But when we read a psalm, we often have like quite a crisis kind of point beginning, and then there's a twist and it becomes positive, and the psalmist kind of says, but God is my deliverer. And that you'd often get that pattern. In Psalm 40, it's the other way around. So that you have David reflecting on a past wonderful time in his life that he can think about, but you find out that he's currently in the pit again, so as it were, and he's desperate again, and it just ends with him saying, God, you're my help. Don't delay. Hurry up and please make haste to come and save me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that at least I suppose is quite very honest about what life can be like. You don't always have it's tough, but I know that God's going to come and it will be fine. I mean, this psalm kind of says, well, actually, sometimes you're in a time in your life where it's tough and you can't really see a way out, and that's it, and that's where it ends. And this psalm kind of does that by stopping there and having a negative kind of end, I think.
Well, that seems to be, I guess, the point you're making around waiting, is that you wait, you don't know when it will end, when it will finish. And even within those psalms where you get that pattern, I remember, Jord, Psalm 13 was a classic of your acronym of CPT, of, was it complaint, plea and trust? You got very clear sections. There still could be quite a large time gap in between when those different things occur as well. Mm-hmm. And both of those things are really powerful to teach, in that having it all condensed means that you know that with God and trusting in him, there will be an end at some point. So that gives me confidence that whilst I might not see an end now, that God will bring an end at some point, whether now in my lifetime or in the future, depending on what I'm praying about. But then this psalm is also comforting and gives me confidence in God that sometimes you just have to wait for God, and there may not be a conclusion that I wish I had it now. I want to be patient. I want to be patient now. It doesn't really work like that. Fascinating.
I think it's really encouraging as well, isn't it, that we all sometimes start with really great intentions, and even if we are struggling, we perhaps at times, I'm world's worst at this, try to mask it and not be honest and open to myself or to others, or sometimes even though I know God knows, that honesty isn't there. And I think it's really encouraging to look at a man like David, who was, the king, who's a man after God's own heart, as we've said so often, and how he really demonstrates to us how we have to be honest with ourselves and also show that honesty in our lives, in our relationship and communication with God. And that can really, help and encourage us when we're going through these challenging times, I think, to remember that, even David went through these real low points in his life where he felt he was in the pit and, you know, he was in quite a dark place. And we've seen that so often, haven't we, Phil, when we've looked at the various Psalms in book 1.
So within
Yeah.
that structure then, Sam, with those two halves and the reflection on the past and perhaps the present circumstance, what is it that the psalmist is using that first half for then? How would you start to get us into the psalm and see why there's that past reflection? What are we taught there?
So when we in the first few verses, David is like talking about this this past situation, and he gives a little bit of, he describes it, doesn't he? He says, I waited, God drew me up from the pit of destruction, and he describes it as a miry bog and set my feet upon a rock. So maybe it's worth thinking just about that, to think about what the problem is in this past kind of situation that he talks about. So we were talking about when you have in a psalm and a kind of something that's happened, and you can kind of connect it with a bit of narrative that you to that character, to that. Let's say David. So often the psalms start with like a little heading that says, this song is about this particular event, and you do have that, but often you don't have that, and we don't have that here. So I think what I found is particularly helpful is seeing that a lot of this imagery and these kind of pictures that David talks about in the Psalms aren't specifically talking about an event that we know about, but they're deliberately these kind of pictures that are reflecting or like developing other ideas or pictures that have already been established in the kind of the scriptures in the Old Testament particularly. So the Psalms are like developing these images, right from Genesis, right from the beginning. And so because from that kind of point of view, you don't read it and think, oh, the pit, okay, when have I been in a pit kind of thing. But you think, oh, that's an image that is talking about how, a place really far away from God, down in the dark, kind of in the darkness. And God is in heaven, and I'm right down in this pit, and the walls are like sticky and I can't climb out of it. And they're like clay, and you instantly start seeing, oh, it's like the stuff that I'm made of, like what Genesis, man is made from humans are made from the dust of the earth, and women, like the clay, like there's all these like images and these pictures, to kind of develop that kind of theme. And I think the very fact that David says this place that I'm in is like walls of clay, he's reflecting on how it's not just an external problem. It's not just, oh, it's my enemies, or it's something I can point to and say that's the reason why I'm in this pit. But actually, it's partly I'm made of the stuff that's caused me to be in this place. So when you read it like that, you see it's a much bigger, deeper kind of image that anyone in any kind of situation can reflect on. So you start and you see he's talking about him in this pit, in this miry bog, but really that's any difficult place that we get in, that maybe is because of others that have done stuff, or just a challenging situation that's out of our control. But often it's because of what we've done or how we've reacted, and you kind of, our own weaknesses and failings find us, because of that, we find ourselves in these really difficult places. And that is quite a helpful way of seeing how, just right at the outset, it just gives you a picture that's just so perfectly describes our problems. And you can instantly relate, I've been in a place like that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's how it starts. And it was your question about what he then goes on to.
No, I just wanted to see. So you painted the two parts. So I was interested to see, what is he trying to draw from in this past imagery? And I think that was really good to see that there is this bog. And as you were saying, Jord, I think in a previous video, we probably don't know, as Sam's saying, of any specific occasion where David was in a pit and then he was suddenly put on some rocks. But those metaphors, as you said, both from what he's observing in his world around him, and also that musing on scriptural images that he's thinking about previously, how he meditates on God's law, make that just such a powerful thing to consider. So he's reflecting on this pit and then mire, but then there's God's worked to get him out of there, has he? And
yeah, so it says in verse 3, God, like you've said, he sets, at the end of verse 2, set my feet upon a rock, and he puts a new song in my mouth, a song of praise. And that then causes him to kind of reflect on, happy, blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust. So he's thinking, I was in that place and I could not see how I was going to get out of that. And God has done this wonderful thing in lifting me out and giving me this new song to like kind of go on in life rejoicing and having this new kind of gladness about being able, when you're in a really difficult place and you just can't see how you can get out of it, and then you get out of it, it kind of gives you that confidence and kind of spring in your step to kind of, I've got a new thing to sing about kind of thing. So, I mean, there's more in that, I think. I think maybe throughout the Psalms, that idea of song and particularly a new song that comes quite a lot, doesn't it, in the Psalms? But so he then reflects on blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, and goes on to talk about how God is wonderful. He's done these wonderful deeds. He says in verse 5, you have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts toward us. So he's thinking about how God thinks about us. And he doesn't just say him, does he? He says us. And you see how he goes on to not just talk. It starts quite personal that he's in this problem, but he then says, God's done wonderful things. That's something that he did for me in lifting me out of that. But he's done wonderful things to so many people. And it's important he sees the importance of proclaiming the greatness of God to lots of people and sharing like these deeds that God has done with others. So that's what he says in verse 5, I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than can be told. So it's really, really positive. Like he's in this a very negative kind of start, but it suddenly becomes really positive and stays positive for quite a while in this first part of the psalm.
It's like he's reflecting on this jubilation or elation that God has saved him, hasn't he? And maybe to remind himself of when God's done that in the past to help him cope with something he's experiencing in the present. I guess you're going to come on to that, but that's what you mentioned. The second half is the present tense. I'm thinking I might think of difficult times I've been in and how I've come through them to help remind me about some while I'm in the current state I'm in, that there is some way out.
That's like connected to what we were saying before about how it ends negative, and that's quite helpful because it's being brutally honest about what life can be like. But at the same time, the positive way is to see that here is, like you've said, here's David in as we're going to see it, in a present crisis, but he's saying, well, if I look back in my past, God helped me then. And that's a useful thing to do, I suppose. The little, sometimes when you're in a really difficult time in your life, that one thing that you can do is look at your past. You can't look at the future. Sometimes you have you don't know what's going to happen to you, and sometimes you cannot see any way out, but you can look at the past and you can see how God has been with you and helped you, and and you can see that in your life, and that's what David's doing here. That's what he's doing. He's seeing also that as a really important thing to do, which is, and
if you're sharing that with others, you can share and gain confidence from them as well. If you've told me how you've come from difficult place, we had that, Jord, didn't we, with Nick? He was talking about how he had been in a difficult place and now he's still struggling with it, but he's it was almost like the psalm was recording what he was feeling at the time himself, and that gave us encouragement to know that he felt that God was working with him through that dark place in a similar way. So then verse 6, Sam, it seems to sort of interesting pivot here to sacrifices and offerings and that sort of stuff. What's that about?
Well, I think maybe we can come and talk about these few verses in a bit in light of the New Testament, because these next 3 verses are like a little section, 6, 7, and 8, and they're quoted in the New Testament in Hebrews. So I think, but just to see it in its context here, it's going to move on. David's going to move on to talk about how I delight, in verse 8, to do your will, O my God, your law is within my heart. And that is in contrast to what he's just previously said when he says God's not concerned, like he's not delighted in sacrifice and offering, but you burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. And then he says in verse 7, behold, I come in the scroll of the book that is written of me, I delight to do your will. So I think one of the things that possibly David is kind of referring to here is that he sees himself as at least partly talked about in the teachings of God, because he's the king. And there's this relationship that Israel have with God, this covenant relationship. And he is saying, I know that I'm the king and I'm responsible. And I know that I have to be the one that leads the people and makes sure that the people know the good things of God, but keep the laws and the teachings. And so he's kind of saying, I delight and I have that. And I know that I'm coming as that one that's talked about in the scriptures. And so I suppose one place to go to, which might be useful, would be Deuteronomy chapter 17, where in the law, it talks about the king and their kind of responsibility. So if we go in at verse 14, I think maybe that way it starts. There in verse 14, it says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. And then if we move on, so it's talking about when you come into the land and you have a king, it says in verse 18, it says, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priest. It shall be with him, he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and the statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right or the left, that he may continue long in his kingdom. So he and his children in Israel. So it's David is kind of seeing how it's very important as a king, as the law says, to have the good things of God and his teachings in your heart, and he recognizes this kind of responsible position of leading the nation in the ways of God and keeping the words of this law. That's what Psalms, the whole book of Psalms begins with, isn't it? With the happy is the man that meditates day and night on the law. And like, it's kind of repeating that same theme here, but David as a king, he's got that added flavor of, I'm the king. I can see that the Bible talks about how the king needs to be like this, and I need to do this, and I need to proclaim and delight in the goodness of God. And he's kind of, just as a final point on this, he's led to this from being in the pit and God lifting him out, and that's leading him to then say, God's wonderful, and it's reminding him of his responsibility to be filled with the things of God and to share that with everyone else and proclaim that and lead the people in kind of obedience to the teachings of God, I suppose.
It really struck me when you were talking about that, Sam, with the aspect in verse 19 of doing them, and in verse 8, I delight to do your will. So that aspect is like you brought out of you internalizing it, and then it's coming out in the way that you're living. And I suppose as David as king, that was so important, as you highlighted, for him to do. And it is fascinating that, this action came out of a really difficult situation that he found himself in.
Yeah, that's true. When you were kind of thinking about how you can, in our lives, that's a very positive thing. Weirdly to think of, like, when you can have it really tough and really difficult. Actually, it is true that sometimes real hardship and trials can bring out of you good, because it's when you're at the real low, you kind of have to turn to God sometimes, and that kind of reinforces what's really important. When everything's going fine, you can kind of almost forget about what really is important in your life. But when things are tough, a lot of good can come of that.
And I thought it was just really interesting as well how in verse 20 the reason was that his heart may not be lifted up, and you focused on in verse 4 of Psalm 40 about blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, the same sort of phrase that we keep having in the psalm, as you mentioned, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray. So again, it's like similar themes of throughout scripture of what God wants.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because he says in verse 8 there that you just read, the law's within my heart, but he goes on to say in verse 10, I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. So he says, on face value, you kind of think, is that a contradiction? He's like saying there's got to be something here in my heart, it needs to be there. And then he says, but I haven't hidden it there. But I think what he's saying is, you first of all have to be like, I delight to do your will, and that comes from having your teachings and your words in my heart. Like, I've got to hold them as precious, but they can't stay there. And that's partly the idea of doing your will. I have to share them with others. That's a really important thing. To proclaim these things and to kind of, what does he say? I've told, verse 9, the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. So it's just interesting to see how the word heart is used in those two different ways, that your heart has to have the things of God. Your innermost self has to embrace the things of God and hold them as precious, but it also has to then, something has to happen because of that. It has to manifest it. It has to come out, and people have to see it. That's part. It's kind of what you're saying about doing it. Just read it and think about it. You then have to do it, and it has to become a real thing about that. You do in your life. Okay, so as we kind of like move to like the end maybe of this first part, before we kind of move into the darker kind of present crisis that David finds himself in, it's interesting to see how the same words crop up in like the first part and the second part. So we've just finished talking about how David recognizes the need to not like hold in the good things of God and the teachings, and he says there in verse 10, I have not hidden your deliverance within my heart. Or in verse 9 actually is the word where he said, behold, I have not restrained my lips. So he's talking about that. And then when you get, you can see it there, when you get into verse 11, he then moves to say, and God, you haven't restrained your mercy from me. So there's a nice little kind of play on this idea of David saying, I haven't kept these things in, and you haven't kept your mercy in as well. You've let your mercy come upon me. And your steadfast love, which he's kind of rejoicing in because of this, coming back right to the beginning of the psalm, because of this deliverance from this horrible pit that he's found himself in. So it then moves into the second part of the psalm. And as we've kind of talked about, we find that actually he in the current time, David is actually in one of those pits again, and he describes that in verse 12, because he says, even though, and it's probably worth noting as well that even though this second part is largely quite negative and like ends with, please hurry up and save me, God, there are little places where he still recognizes that, like we've just read, God will not restrain his mercy, which is really positive, and his steadfast love will ever preserve me. So he says that, And he's saying that at this time of kind of when the evils have encompassed me beyond number. And later in verse 16, he says, you know, he does recognize all those that seek you will rejoice and be glad in you, and great is the Lord. But at the same time, he's kind of saying, I get that, like that's true. I can still hold on to those truths that God's mercy will ultimately come. But he still also says, but I'm in this really difficult place, and it's almost like he's saying, I can't quite see how that mercy is coming now. It's not coming now. And he says in verse 13, make haste to help me. And he finishes with, you know, you are my help and my deliverer. You're the one that can help me, but don't delay, you know, come now. So it's quite like a twist that you get, as we've kind of talked about, of going from this very, very confident, great is God in all of these wonderful things he's done, and I need to proclaim this to everyone. I recognize that is my responsibility. But now he's like, but I'm right back in that pit again, and I really need God to come now. So there's a number of, there's one thing that I wanted to say actually about this kind of second part, which is quite, we've already talked about it with the pit and the clay, and how it kind of almost feels like it's talking about part of the problem here is David himself, and he recognizes his own iniquities. But he says that in verse 12. So in this kind of present crisis, he says, my iniquities have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head. My heart fails me. And then in verse 4, and then he says, be pleased, O Lord, to deliver me, make haste to help me. And then he says in verse 14, let those be put to shame and disappointed altogether who seek to snatch my life, who delight in my hurt, who say, ah, ha, ha. So there's clearly enemies, where he's talking about an external problem that are kind of out of his control. And he's saying, this is really tough there. And it says, look, they delight in my hurt, just like he said earlier, I delight in the law of God. So these people are actually delighting in my suffering, in my pain, which is a big like twist of the like change that has happened. But what he also says is that his iniquities are part of the problem, and they are more than the hairs of my head. And again, you can see the verbal connections between the part 1 and part 2, because he said right at the beginning, or in verse 5, you've multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds, and they're more than can be told. So he says there at the end of verse 5, yet they are more than that can be told. That's the same Hebrew. And he's saying, God's got all of these many wondrous things. There's so many that are innumerable. But then he goes on to say, but my sins and my iniquities are like the hairs of my head. They are more than can be told as well. So there's a contrast here. And like David is recognizing, part of the problem is not just something you can kind of point to these people that want to snatch away his life, but part of the problem is himself, and how maybe how he's dealt with it, or maybe even how he's caused this problem. We don't know, but he recognizes that it's not just other people or other things that have happened to cause him to suffer here. It is himself. And that, I suppose, the blurring of that line is a very profound point to make, because that's so true, isn't it? That's one of the things I thought, that in our lives, when things are tough, we don't necessarily behave the best. And often some things can be tough because we haven't behaved the best. And they're kind of almost one and the same thing. And the idea of reflecting on our own sufferings as part of a bigger picture, that really we're a human being that is sinful and weak, and we don't always do what we should, and we often don't do what we should, but that's part of something bigger. And so all the problems out there in our life, we're part of that, and our sins and other people's sins, it's all one big mess that can get us really down. And what's helpful in all of this is to see that the psalm kind of recognizes that it says we can get into these places where that we've sometimes got ourselves into, and that's even harder than and sometimes it's even harder to see a way out when we're in that situation, partly because of our own failings, because it's not like you can just say, oh well, as long as that stops happening, that other thing, then it'll be fine. But if it's you, if it's something you've done or something you're continuing in or whatever, you can't just brush it aside. You've got to live with it. And you probably think it's going to carry on happening. So it's really tough to be made aware of that. And I think it's helpful that the Psalm recognizes that. And David himself is saying, like, my iniquities are like more than the hairs of my head. And then he says, look, my heart fails me. Just like he said before, that his heart delighted in the law of God. Now it's broken. It's like it's not working. It's not doing what he knows it should do. So there is comfort kind of strangely in that, I think, in seeing how seeing how this psalm is being very honest and recognizing that we can have that in our life. But the answer is God. That's the answer. That's the thing that can lift us out and even overcome our iniquities. It's God who can help us get through that and save us, deliver us from sin.
And through that waiting, isn't it, that God will do that. It may not be now, it might not be for a while, and might be we fall back in the pit again, as you've explained. But he knows that God is his help and his deliverer to help him out of that.
It's like he says again. He says as well in verse 12, "I cannot see," which is such a powerful picture of him saying, I mean, iniquities. There's so many. My sins are all around me. I can't see, and that's such a contrast from when he said in verse 3, "Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord." So from the beginning and that deliverance, he says, look, everyone can see this and learn from it. And it's wonderful that we can all see the wonderful works of God. And now he's saying, I can't see because my iniquities are just blocking my vision and I can't see a way past out of it. So, but waiting, that's the key, isn't it?
And I think what I found really helpful in what you just sort of explained, Sam, in relation to this psalm, is that aspect of how David really wanted to be how he was back at the first part of this psalm. He did really desire to, to be able to see God's steadfast love again and to see his forgiveness. But whatever he's trying to do in get back to that place, he's really struggling to get through that. And I think, for anyone's listening, I definitely can resonate with this, that, sometimes we want to be back to that place, but we are trapped in this pit, or we're halfway up the pit and we're slipping back down. And like we you've both said, it is about patiently waiting, as the opening verse was, for the Lord. And that's not easy, as David's really highlighting in the psalm. But I think, if we can have that honesty, in our relationship and conversations with God and each other, then hopefully that can help us get back to that place like it did for David, even if it is really dark and challenging. I think that's really, really helpful in what you've just sort of brought out. So where does this go next then, Sam, in relation to sort of getting towards the back end of the psalm in this sort of more negative tone than the start?
Well, you mean the last few verses?
Yeah, sort of. So sort of after this this aspect of verse 12 that you've just elaborated on.
So, well, he starts talking about. He says in verse 13, "Make haste to help me," and then he does two things. He starts talking about those who his enemies and those people that kind of delight in his sufferings. And he says he wants those people to be put to it's actually really interesting to think how that he doesn't actually say in other places in Psalms you can get quite language that wants the enemies to be destroyed, but here if you look, he doesn't say that. He says, let those be put to shame who seek to snatch away my life. Let them be turned back and brought to dishonor. Let them be appalled. Let them be appalled because of their shame. So he actually wants his enemies not just to stop being the things that they are, because it's hurting him, but he wants them to be ashamed of the way they are, which is really more getting at the problem, isn't it? I don't just want the enemies to go. I want them to realize that what they're doing is shameful. That's a really hard thing, isn't it? To want for the people who do cause you suffering, or the things that you can resent and want to just go away, but actually for you to want those things to be transformed, for them to truly see what they're doing is wrong, and you want them to see, I suppose, is kind of what he's saying, which is a better way of seeing things, isn't it? That let them be shamed, not destroyed, but let them actually realize. It's almost like there's an insight to him wanting them to actually, because of the shame that comes upon them, then themselves be transformed and kind of become the people that then he talks about in verse 16. Yeah. So after that, he then says, but may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. So, and say continually, great is the Lord. Unlike those who say, aha, aha, he wants, there's a little kind of a parallel there with, that's the things that they say. What I want is for them to be ashamed of that, and I suppose become the people that say, great is the Lord. Yeah.
Yeah, well, David had many people in his life that were, complete enemies, but there are others that turned against him that he probably wished, really, why did you make that choice? I'm thinking of people like Joab, for example, who was his right-hand man, but he various times defected from David because he felt David was a weaker person, or even I think he describes him as like, you're harder than me, you're tougher. These sons of Zeruiah, I think they're related to David in some way, but he felt they're almost just didn't have that sort of feeling and godliness that was required, and to feel sometimes that shame. I don't know if that's what they're talking about here, but I can really imagine David as a king. I just want these people to turn back, and that they almost need to be put to shame because of what they're trying to do in this instance. Or Absalom as a classic, we've come across him a couple of times, haven't we, Jord? One specific psalm that was talking about that. He was sort of so full of himself that he wanted to be the king. David, I'm sure, wished that he would feel some shame and turn back around, and he definitely didn't want David to be king, and David would have rather he was shamed and saw the error of his ways. So.
Yeah, that's true. And so like, he says in verse 17, as for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. So even though he's still in this position, he still finishes with like, he still says, but God is still thinking of me. God still knows. It's just, I don't know when that's going to happen. I don't know. And then he says, don't delay, please hurry up and come. So it's like a desperate end. It's someone who's really desperate, and it's that's where it ends. You don't have the lifting out of the pit this time. You just have that. Maybe we could just, like, the last thing that I wanted to say was about the New Testament. Briefly, just to talk, because I'm sure that you've talked a lot about messianic psalms and kind of connections with the Lord Jesus Christ, and Jesus is talked about in Hebrews chapter 10, and this psalm's quoted there. Those couple of verses that we read previously, versus the bit about sacrifice and offering. So Hebrews 12, is it?
Sorry, you want me to get to Hebrews 10? Sorry, I was flicking.
Oh, it's in both, is it? All right, there we go. It's, yeah. So there in verse 6.
Yeah.
Oh no, verse 5, isn't it? It starts earlier than that. So consequently, when came into the world, he said. So that's interesting. And just to note, it says Jesus said. Does it say that actually? Is it talking about Jesus there?
Yeah, it's missing a word in this
Yeah.
version of ESV. In the my ESV, it says consequently when Christ came into the
Yeah, I
world.
thought
There's
it
something missing there.
All right. Okay. Well, anyway, so yeah, I mean, it quotes the Psalm: "Sacrifices and offerings have not desired, but a body have you prepared for me." So there's a little difference there because it didn't say that. I don't think it said. It said in the Psalm, and I know you've given me an open ear. So it's the same kind of thing, but in the Psalm, it's maybe a bit more connecting back with that, like in the pit, because the Hebrew of an open ear is digging out your ears. So it's like almost like God's dug out all of the dirt that they's got filling up his ears in this pit. So it's a bit more kind of descriptive, like you've dug out my ears so that I can actually hear. But now it says, a body you've prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I've come to do your will, O God. And so it quotes the Psalm, and we talked about how that refers to, in the context of the Psalm, it's David, and David is saying, you didn't really want the sacrifices and the offerings, and you didn't really, it wasn't like dead animals or, the blood of these animals that really was what you wanted. What you wanted is, you wanted people to what he says is delight to do your will. And then he goes on to talk about steadfast love and your faithfulness. And it's like he's saying, it's not the sacrifices, it's what's behind them. It's the meaning of what really we're doing here when we're recognizing the death of this thing and reflecting on kind of the greatness of God. Why are we giving you all of these animals? Why are we sacrificing? Because you are great. And what does that mean? Well, it means because you're merciful and you are salvation and you are faithful and you have this mercy and love, and that it's all the good things of God, that really that's what God wants. And so David's kind of talking about that. And then when we come to Hebrews, what I found just quite again, another like kind of interesting twist is that Hebrews then takes it and says, this is actually like transformed to be talking about Jesus. And it's the same kind of idea that Jesus is someone who came, just like David came, to delight in God's teachings. And Jesus was someone who delighted in his Father's teachings and was obedient always, and manifested that steadfast love and that faithfulness and that mercy that his Father was, but also was a sacrifice. And that's the step that the Psalm doesn't make. The Psalm just says, you didn't want the sacrifices, this is what you wanted. But then when you get to Hebrews, it says the same thing, but you realize that kind of the twist is, but there was actually a sacrifice, that Jesus, that embodiment of those good things of God was given as the perfect once for all kind of sacrifice to redeem all of these people out of the pit. Anyone that finds himself in those situations because of their weaknesses and their sins, it's the Lord Jesus Christ and his perfect sacrifice which does that, which is quite another little layer that Hebrews adds on to this kind of reflecting on. It's not sacrifice, it's actually delighting in God and his wondrous things, but then that was embodied in a sacrifice in Jesus. So that's kind of it's yeah.
And for those of you watching, you might want to look at Exodus 21 at some point, which is a different story but very much related, where you got a slave who commits himself to his master, and he gets his ear dug, sort of pinned to the wall of his master, because he's sacrificing himself to follow after his master. Find the connections, let us know in the comments. But there's quite another twist again that Sam's sort of picking up as well with this, that it's not about the animals that matter, really. It's about yourself, the body, and that's what Jesus did, but that's for another time. Brilliant. So fascinating how it picks up these Psalms and gives them that extra spin that I wouldn't have picked out, but having that inspiration of those authors in the New Testament really helping us understand how they've got yet another layer to them. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So how would you then summarize, Sam, and sort of a key, there's plenty you've covered for us, but as a key message for people to think about?
I suppose like the obvious one for me, and the one that I found the most probably the one that I keep coming back to is this idea that the time is kind of the way the psalm is structured, with someone reflecting on something really tough and then leading to something that's that causes you to rejoice because God's delivered you, but then it goes back into it. You know, that progression, ending with someone who's just in a desperate place and not knowing what the future is going to be. I found that just quite a powerful message and helpful. Strangely, it's very uplifting and exhortational to think of how the scriptures recognize that in our lives things can be really tough and we don't know how to get past them or through them, and sometimes even where, you know, the obvious answers of like, well, read the scriptures and, you know, talk to your brothers and sisters and be encouraged, and all of those things are true and they're good and they can help. But sometimes you can be in a place where it just doesn't, you just can't, it's like you can't hear it. It's not working because you're really low. And I suppose in a way that psalm, it recognizes that is a real human experience, that even all the wonderful things that have happened and the wonderful things about our faith and God and that we know about, even that, which should help us get out of the pit, it's still true that we can fall into a place where it's just not, it doesn't seem to be working. And it's more of a desperate place where we're just kind of saying, well, if you are going to come and help us, God, can you do it now? And I just think that's very powerful, that the psalm is just so honest and open about recognizing that, and that is a helpful thing, I think, that I found.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that psalm with us. So much for us to ponder and consider more, and I've got a lot out of this. Jord, any final words?
No, I was just going to say thanks so much, Sam. That was a really comprehensive overlook of that psalm, and I completely agree with your sort of take-home point. I don't think I can really add much to that, apart from, you know, if any of you, like myself at times, are feeling poor and needy, I'm going to try and remember that final sort of words of, but the Lord takes thought for me, and he's our help and our deliverer. And I suppose our prayer from this is, you know, that our God doesn't delay and he will send back Jesus soon to set up his kingdom on the earth. So thanks, Sam, for your thoughts tonight, and God bless to all you who are watching, and may you be able to see God as your help and deliverer, and remember that he takes thought for you. God bless.